Yeah. Hey, everybody. It's Brian Wilson here for the Computational Jurisdiction Workshop session in the 2019 MIT Computational Law course. I'm joined by Brian Ulysny, Thomson Reuters Labs, and our dear colleague, Dazza Greenwood. And we're going to be kind of meandering around this idea of what a computational jurisdiction might look like as per a video that Christoph Pereira from GE posed at the 2017 MIT Legal Forum. And so we're going to talk about some of the ways that that could be designed, what it might look like as far as how it is organized, and then different mechanisms that could be used in order to ensure a certain level of integrity just with regard to being able to control the things that would need to be controlled and ensure the outcomes that we would find desirable. So as always, provide your feedback to this session in our Pigeonhole widget, and we'll wait a couple more minutes, but before getting going in earnest. But in the meantime, Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So Brian Ulysny, I run Thomson Reuters Labs Americas. So I have a group of data scientists and data viz folks in Boston. We deal with Thomson Reuters that provides information for professionals, particularly legal professionals, through the Westlaw platform and other legal products, as well as tax. And of course, we've got the Reuters News Agency. And then I've also got a small lab in Dallas that's data scientists and blockchain type folks. So we're interested in all kinds of distributed ledger applications for legal and tax. And yeah, happy to be here as always.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me a little tilt.
Yeah.
Hi. And just by way of just a little bit of context, this is the session of Brian and Brian, but I just want to vector forward that the underlying idea was that of Christoph Pereira, as you said, from GE, and that was at and the idea was such a good one that it's engendered a lot of conversation, a lot of brainstorming in the almost year and a half since they had it. And that's partly why we wanted to continue to explore it as a breakout session now. And Brian had the very wise idea that maybe I should tell Christoph that we're doing this. And so I did do that. And we had a nice chat with him last night. And just to bring everyone up to date, Brian Wilson and I kind of briefed him on what the plan was. He was delighted with it, which is good. And we asked him, as per your suggestion, Brian Ulysny, have you had any further thinking or any suggestions on questions that maybe we should focus on? The main thing that he said is, well, it's good to, once you kind of discuss the idea and kind of get your head around it, really to focus on what is the smallest appropriate one could deploy and test the idea. And Brian had some ideas about, or you guys had discussed like a cruise ship as an example, and Burning Man in some ways as an example. And he blew my mind, which is probably why I wanted to pop in this session a little bit of maybe one way you could test it would be with a Burning Man camp that did this. And as soon as he said that, everybody was thinking, well, yeah, we could do that. So there may be an opportunity for that's one fun, at least example of a way one could take some aspect or aspects of the idea and begin to build out like a contained environment in time, like a week, and in space, and think about what elements would be engineerable and what kind of data could you get and how could one go forward. So that was sort of a somewhat whimsical, fun idea. Maybe we'll come up with others during the course of the session.
Yeah. That's great. And said we got some good feedback. So I think to start, we put together notes, and we can kind of walk through those notes just a little bit to kind of provide context. But then, really from there, we'll start diving into questions. So for me, in my experience as a law student, I got to work under Kansas City, Missouri's Chief Innovation Officer on the Smart and Connected Cities project. And that project was a joint public-private partnership between Kansas City, Cisco, and Sprint. And the goal of it was to embed a really large sensor network around Kansas City streetcar corridor and use those sensors in order to kind of gain insights about, the air quality, transportation flow, different aspects like that. But then also use it to help do things like turn the lights on when there are more people around late at night, so that you can help hopefully prevent crime or just make the city more comfortable and user friendly. And in that project, one of the best conversations that I had was with this retired nuclear systems engineer who was asking, trying to hypothesize different systems that were already out there that were very measurable in the same way that smart cities would be measurable.
Smooth.
And it to that end, we talked about, you can measure everything on a cruise ship because you know everything that goes on it. And with that, it's like, okay, well, this is this very large and kind of portable city. It's in a way a portable computational jurisdiction. I know a lot of cruise lines now, they have the same sorts of issues with information security that a computational jurisdiction would surely have. At least there would be some overlap there. But I think, having that sense of, there are going to be some information security requirements, it definitely is a good backdrop against which to set the computational jurisdiction idea. And then also, I think some of the things that we touched on yesterday in the course, as far as having, some security principles by design that are kind of built into the framework from which you're starting, this kind of gets to this larger idea of, okay, if we're having a computational jurisdiction, we need to start from a series of principles and then use that series of principles to design the technology and the legal applications around it so that they can function in the way that we want. So what, in your mind, would be some good principles that we could have to start with? I wonder. That's open to anyone.
Can we see the pigeonhole?
Oh, yeah. So, participatory decision making seems like a really interesting one because, I know with especially quadratic voting now that you can do with some of the blockchain apps and smart contracts that allows for some really creative possibilities, especially with figuring out which permutations of voting schemes you might want. So that could be a fun one.
Yeah, voting schemes seem like a really natural way that wouldn't require too much in terms of sensors. And
yeah, it's pretty straightforward, and I think that also, if we take one step from voting schemes, you could get to the idea of self-sovereign identity again, and just have your self-source data producer interacting with all of the other computational apps that are in this computational hypothetical jurisdiction. And going back to the cruise ship analogy, I think it was Carnival announced their passport thing. It's like a wearable device that you can use to pay on the cruise ship in whatever currency that you have. You can verify that you're over 21. You can verify that, or whatever the drinking age is wherever you are, so 18. In a lot of places, you can verify that you've signed up for certain sessions with whether it's a spa or, special movie. I don't know. Haven't been on very many cruise ships recently, but what are some other applications that you could think of that might be computed out of a wearable, just like taking away the self-sourcing data part of it for a moment, but like just like what are some cool things that a wearable could do in a computational jurisdiction?
Can I offer something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing that calls to mind is a very rich thread of the discussion that followed Christoph's presentation and his kind of good-natured challenge to co-think that how to build this prototype idea, and it was what kind of data would we have, what kind of data would be appropriate. And most of the discussion was around personal data that would come from a phone or that people would self-enter. We talked about gamification. We talked about and then what is the kind of value proposition? So what sorts of data would be relevant to and help to enable a computational legal system like parking and traffic data, location, tax data. Transactions, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the data that's coming from individuals was very much part of the brainstorming last year.
Yeah, I mean, parking seems like a straightforward because you could actually do all kinds of A/B testing with these smart parking meters, right? You could have through your phone, you actually get they tell you what the policies are, right? Oh, I don't need to pay on Sundays. Oh, and then you could definitely do lots of A/B. Maybe the city of Boston is already doing that in these places. And you could then see, like, well, so how long do people stay in parking spots? How full are they? How easy it is to find, in certain parts of the city. Yeah, maybe that would be actually we could proactively go talk to some of these parking folks and talk about parking policies.
Yeah, well, and depending on how big that network is too, you could monitor things like commute times to see how far people are commuting from. What for different areas of the city, whether it's socioeconomic or otherwise, you could start getting an understanding of what the factors are that are contributing to maybe undesirable outcomes and start proactively trying to address those as well.
Yeah, you could play with commuter taxes and like I'd be willing to pay a tax to to drive into the city if I was more or less guaranteed that there would be a parking spot.
You can go ahead and reserve it before you even set out at a certain time, and then have I know I think it was Open Law. They did a really cool demo one time. I think it was last year when I was in New York for the Computational Law and Blockchain Festival there, but they had a live example of a sensor that they could embed in a crate for shipping. And with that, if you had some sort of perishable good like flour, you could monitor the humidity of the crate. And if it passed a certain threshold, there would be certain penalties imposed automatically for however long it was at that temperature or that humidity level. And then you could use that to kind of have these contracts that are automatically executing based on that. And I'm thinking, if you spend a certain amount of time, in that parking space, it can very nominally just give you that liability for whatever amount of time that you actually had, instead of the system that we have now where you put in so many quarters for an hour or so many quarters for 2 hours, and then you maybe wind up spending way longer there and you get an additional penalty, or maybe you suddenly get called away and you've wasted that 80% of the money that you spent. So I think that ability to kind of reach a deeper level of kind of like customization appeals to a lot of people, because it's actually making it so that the transactional experience is one that actually matches what you're like the the cost actually matches the service or the benefit that you're getting. And so looking at some of the ways that we might test this, I think in reality, one of the easier things to do could be to have something like a Burning Man camp where maybe you monitor a handful of those outcomes. Maybe you start with 5. Maybe you start with kind of like the mobility in and out of the camp. Then you can look at and you can track that based on sensors. You can track, how long are people in the camp? If people are wearing the sensors out of the camp and going back and forth to other places, can we come up with a way to monitor that? From there, you could also monitor maybe the goods that are going in and out of the camp if there's a system for that. What are, in your mind, Brian, are there any issues that you could think of just like with a regular old campsite that you could start monitoring that could kind of in a way be analogous to something that you could use in a larger scale jurisdiction?
Yeah, so just to put the camp stuff on hold for a second. So I had put on Telegram this paper that we had done in my previous job, and which might actually lend itself to these kinds of experiments. And it was about setting policies. So you have a chat application, and you want to set policies about who you will exchange information with, and you can also set policies about access to data that you have. So access to databases. So there's like certain people can get certain kinds of information about personnel, sensitive information and not. And that was kind of interesting because it was this decentralized thing where everyone could have people could have different policies, and then you could see the behavior that emerged of who could talk to who, then who communicated with who, and so on. And definitely work through issues about information exchange among bureaucracies and things like that way.
Yeah, I think that gets to a larger issue that we've talked about in some other sessions too, of going from something that's, law-centered to something that's human-centered. So we're taking laws and regulations, which by their very nature, at the beginning were centered on the law, and it's moving it to where it's something centered around human interaction. And I think that as a principle is something that we all here can be very big fans of, because now we're living in an environment where we're producing data. We've got data exhaust that covers all of these different things that have all these different behaviors that we have on a daily basis. A lot of it that we aren't even cognizant of, and that data can be used to reduce a lot of the burdens that we go through in the legal process. The legal processes that we have now, lots of them were designed for, not having very much trust within the system. So requiring lots of papers to go back and forth to lots of different people. So now that we can kind of automate a little bit that degree of trust, whether it's through something like multi-factor authentication or something else, that serves as a really exciting possibility, I think, for just the way that the concept of like a justice layer or a legal layer to our society might be imagined. So looking at some of the questions now, what could be some of the best principles to create a computational jurisdiction where self-serving interests do not compromise coherent policy making and rules? And then how are those included for the interests of everyone?
U.S. legal system.
So speaking, I can quickly reference here the I linked to it in our notes, but I think we can start with the 10 principles that they've got for Burning Man, just as a jumping off point, and then move towards, additional kind of principles for building something that serves to be an area where people live and communicate and are interacting with one another. So I will throw these into the comment of your question just so that everybody can see them. Is there now? And now the tools in terms of the origins of the United States, that's a really cool principle to have. Welcome and respect strangers, no for participation. So that's, I think, a good principle that we could rely on. Radical inclusion is the second one, or that was the first one. So gifting is the second one. So they operate in this kind of gift economy where, you know, the value of the gift is unconditional, and when you gift something to somebody else, you don't really contemplate some return or some exchange. And I think that would be a little bit difficult to have in a real place, just because of the nature of the economies that have built up and that exist.
So if you want to continue,
But
I'm sorry for interrupting.
that would be certainly something that would be fun to test out. And in a lot of ways, I think we are already testing some of those out in a computational sense. Like we have records of transactions, and we have centralized institutions and banks and stuff that, you know, kind of do a lot of this computational work for us. So maybe, you know, that exists as sort of a layer on top of all of this.
I mean, these kind of remind me of if you go back to Rawls and, you know, the kinds of principles you can sort of see Rawls, the whole idea of the, you know, the veil of ignorance as being sort of a computational law set up, right? So we're supposed to imagine the rules of society where people don't know what role they're going to play, and so they adopt these rules by, you know, trying to think through, well, if I didn't know what role I was going to play, what rules would I adopt? And he thinks that everyone would choose rules that fit certain criteria, you know, that you would opt for the rules that have the greatest benefit to the least advantaged. And
yeah,
those are actually like very straightforwardly sort of computational kinds of processes. So, you know, so you can even, so that Rawls's critics have different sort of views about, well, it's not just the greatest benefit to the least advantage, but, you know, like maximizability and things like that.
Yeah, I think too the kind of ideas around utilitarianism, just as a philosophical concept, you know, we're starting to get to points where you can actually measure what is the most utilitarian thing, the most utilitarian outcome for a given situation. So I think in terms of like figuring out the economy layer, that's definitely something that could happen. Looking at the third on the list, decommodification. This reflects the idea to create social environments that are unmediated by commercial sponsorships, transactions, or advertising. So basically, focus on the human-centered kind of interaction of things, and I think is a guiding principle that is a positive thing. Obviously, there are, you know, greed can lead to bad things. But I think that kind of is another balance that would have to be sort of figured out in a computational jurisdiction. And maybe you could kind of code that into system rules and some of the ways that smart contracts have emerged, that or even cryptocurrencies. Like there was a cryptocurrency, I forget what it was for, but it was for something that was like part of the proceeds of all the transactions would go to like sustainable Earth. And in the book by Douglas Rushkoff, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus, he talks about, you know, the different kind of outcomes that you could peg a currency to, and so in his mind, or in the book, he talks about how you could tie a currency to the production of the timber production of a region, or the some natural resource production, or gold, or all of these things that over time people have kind of experimented around with. And I think there might be a way to like figure out, if you were to design a computational jurisdiction, yeah, you could design it so that it included a certain amount of decommodification in kind of the same way that zoning prohibits certain buildings from being added to different parts of cities. You would kind of have to have rules like that, I think. But that does point to an exciting possibility of a computational jurisdiction, in that you could actually design that into the rules of the jurisdiction, so that maybe, you know, it's not a very big jurisdiction, but every time you go to your small jurisdiction, you're having this decommodified experience where it's more focused on the human interaction that's there. And moving on down, and we can kind of skip through some of these a little bit in an effort to get to more of the questions, but there's a lot of focus around community, a lot of focus around responsibility, and it seems like a lot of focus on sustainability. And as far as guiding principles, I think, having people who are committed to, putting forth an effort and making sure that people are responsible for different levels of participation, those are definitely good things. The civic responsibility aspect of it is, I think, something that people always talk about, because everybody gets mad at people who don't vote, but then it turns out such a majority of, or such a large group of the population doesn't vote for things, and it's like, well, how could we design something that holds the people who want to be here accountable?
Logic. So it's kind of,
and maybe there are creative ways that you could do that.
Yeah, because
and I'm sure, like, by having something that would be computational in nature, it would be a little bit easier. You could improve that user experience so that it's connecting people to, like, the outcomes that they're looking for a little bit easier.
Yeah, although, so I think, though, Christoph's idea was, there are, sort of political science experiments, right, that you can do. You can say, okay, well, we found that if we move voting to Sundays, that it's more likely that people would vote, and so on. But I think in his original discussion, the idea was that, well, you can try out a bunch of different policies in this kind of synthetic sandbox, and then that led people immediately in the initial discussion to talk about, well, you've only really got data about what people have done under the actual policies, so you don't, you have to make a lot of assumptions about what people would do under other policies, or the idea was that you have to have, like, simulations and agent-based simulations and so on, which gets into, pretty complex stuff. So it's one thing to measure, to kind of model, like, how people walk around in, public areas or something like that. That's kind of straightforward, but like, more at a very complex behavioral layer, where an agent is thinking about, well, I would act this way if I thought that you were going to do this, and
kind of like
that gets very complicated.
Game theory sides of things.
Yeah,
it's funny, as you were saying that, I thought, it would be interesting. What if we had the United Computational States, where there were all these laboratories for figuring out all the different sets of computations that you could have, and you could have different people working in connection with other people in order to achieve kind of maybe a unified set of outcomes that brought them together, but in different and measurable ways that could be used to, if we decide something works great, we can just let other people fork the code of our computational state, and it can be used to, improve outcomes everywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a pretty wild thing, I think. Looking at some more of the questions. I think we're starting to tap into some of the more kind of like the guts of things. Like how do you start mapping out like legislation to behavior, and how do you start like drafting laws that maybe are built on, the computed data that comes from sorts of behavior, or kind of doing that inversely through like setting out a mission of like what desired behaviors are, and then trying to come up with different strategies for achieving those. I'm trying to think of the best way that you could do that, but it would probably have to be under the context of, we've got a group of people here who are trying different stuff, and maybe I know with a lot of the sharing economy discussions that have happened in the last 5 years, different people have brought up the idea of kind of like sunset regulations and regulations that are more temporary in their nature, or that require like revisiting those things after a certain period of time. I know a lot of the everything that came after 9/11 all those years ago, that had like sunset clauses in it that required like feedback to it, and making sure that it is actually setting out to do the things that it wants. Yeah, the Patriot Act. I couldn't think of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you could start to do that within like a single jurisdiction that way a little bit, so that you're actually getting data about what the problem is, and then you can use that data to kind of periodically like see to what extent are we reaching our mission, and if we aren't, what are key factors or any of the performance indicators that show that we aren't where we're supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure about this, but it seems like recent legislation does sometimes include requirements about the data that's gathered that can be used to evaluate it, which is important, because then obviously if you don't bother to gather the data, you can't do an adequate evaluation. But yeah, so that would definitely be an important principle, I think, to
Let's see if we've gotten more of these, or who's got comments. Yeah, so in one of the comments, Nicholas is talking about participatory technologies that can assure democratic validity, and I think that's kind of been muddled a little bit. Just this is a quick reflex reaction, but I think the concept of democratic validity, especially in the context of all of the ability to distort information and have information falsely be sent to people who don't know that it's false, or like ensuring that there is a level of data integrity for the people in a computational jurisdiction. I think that would be something that you would have to definitely address, and I think that's something that people still don't know how to address. I know that that kind of validity, you could even take it a step in a different direction, where you're looking at how can we protect people from like hate speech. It's like there's not an easy fix to this. This is what like some of the best and brightest minds are like trying to figure out. But it's not like I just flip the switch for no hate speech on my website, and boom, it's gone. You've got many factors to deal with, and I'm sure those factors change as the social context of, you know, everything that's happening in society changes too.
Yeah, so I think you'd need to, you know, in the computational jurisdiction, you'd need to control for kind of outside messaging and the ability to control for that. So you'd want to take topics that were sort of neutral as far as the ability to, you know, for a determined cohort on Twitter to kind of change people's minds.
Yeah. Well, and too, I think one thing that would be quite helpful in a computational jurisdiction is that you could have the social network of the computational jurisdiction, and it wouldn't be tied to the it wouldn't be as heavily tied to this huge network of people. It could just be for basic levels of communication between people in the community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having social networks that kind of fit you know, a specific purpose are very important. And not an endorsement, but that's one of the reasons why I think Telegram's such a cool idea as just a channel for communication, is because you can invite whoever you want to it. It's very easy to set up, and you can kind of have discussions, whether they're project-based, whether they're you know, based on something broader like news or just kind of feedback. You can set up your own bots that help you monitor different things. You can input commands that say, you know, what's happening here, and you know, that could very well be something like that could very well be a tool for, you know, ensuring that you're maintaining that level of data integrity in this kind of nebulously abstracted idea that we're concocting here, which is a sentence. That's a sentence I never thought I would say in my life, but it's a fun one nonetheless.
Like a 5-ish minute countdown.
Okay, so we have just been told we've got 5 minutes. So if anybody, oh, we've got 2 new questions even.
Okay.
So we'll kind of walk through those and then wrap up a little bit. Oh, this is an area that we haven't touched on very much, but it's talking about in the big data context, figuring out how to take a database for court decisions that periodically reviews some of the hate speech. So maybe, you know, we talked about kind of breaking it down to a very granular level where, you know, you kind of insulate yourself a little bit from the sorts of the sorts of bad outcomes that you don't want to happen. But you could also do it from the other way, where you go super big at the 30,000 foot level and you start looking at, okay, if I connect my computational jurisdiction to your computational jurisdiction and we aggregate all of our information, let's use that as a way to kind of mine the language and do some cool machine learning stuff on what language means in different contexts, and sentiment analysis and natural language processing, in order to come up with a best metric for, you know, this is definitely hate speech. That could be hate speech considering on the context, and it goes to a specific party, or it's not hate speech and we're good.
Yeah, actually, so I looked into this a while ago, not with hate speech per se, but looking for examples of threatening online speech in like decisions and so on, to do exactly that, machine learning on it. And for one, it was really, really difficult to find examples.
Yeah.
Even of people who have been convicted of threatening people online, which you would think shouldn't be that hard. And then, but there definitely wasn't enough to really
train something that does something meaningfully.
Yeah, exactly. So, and if you have any leads on that, that would be
like data that could be used
on the hate speech front or the threatening speech front, and they're often similar.
Okay, and then to the last question, talking about the interplay between ethics, values, markets, architecture, and legislation. So like, what can we learn about this kind of interplay between all of these pieces that are necessarily connected, in kind of the way that who was it yesterday talking about the Larry Lessig's Coda's Law book, where he talks about that convergence of
Bill Rosenblatt.
yeah, Bill Rosenblatt's discussion yesterday about, you know, like all what they were, but the convergence of kind of these four issues, or of four issues, many of which are included here. But what does that interplay look like in this jurisdiction? And I think, I don't know that I've got a specific answer to that, but I think you could start playing around with ideas of kind of like commodify, at least quantifying them into measurable things. So like looking at that idea that Douglas Rushkoff has, where you can sort of tie a currency to specific commodities. You could tie a computational law jurisdiction, I would think, to, like, as a community, you could tie it to, certain types of crime, maybe like a calculation or a quantification of different crimes that happen, how the markets are doing, what public repairs need to be made, and then the overall satisfaction of the city from the people who are in the community. So, maybe having like a improved feedback loop for, getting citizens to engage and say, what they like, what they don't like, what they would change if they think. I think you could kind of architect something that does, meet the consensus of everybody who's within the network.
Yeah. So David Laser over at Northeastern has a book about designing like participatory democracy.
Awesome.
Like forums for people to discuss things, so that it doesn't become just like the most sharp-elbowed people showing up at congressional town halls.
Yeah.
And,
it's not the loud minority of people who's feeding back into this stuff.
Yeah.
And you could even, I think, tie that, like, have like a kind of make that a requirement of being in the computational jurisdiction, is that you have to provide a base level of feedback about one thing in such and such period, and use that as how you're going to make sure that the city and that kind of like commons area that everybody is a part of is actually commons based on the feedback of everybody, and not just commons based on loudmouth Brian's idea about what the commons should be.
Oh, well.
Now, I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about me.
Okay. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, the Brian squared lecture. But yeah, this has been pretty fun. And I don't know that we have time to get through more of the questions, but we're gonna kind of assemble a report out directly to Christoph Pereira for this lecture. We talked to him on the phone last night, and that was one of the things that he talked about being interested in. And if we should decide to do the computational law, computational states Burning Man camp network, perhaps everybody will be invited.
We should do it at Burning Man, but it should only involve parking spaces.
Oh man,
we should force people to get dressed for work and commute in the desert and park their cars, and that's their only activity.
Have fun.
They would probably. I think the emphasis then would be on actually burning those people and getting back to the fun. But no, this has been really everybody who listened online and contributed. We'll have I think the feedback widget's gonna live live with the comments for another while. So if you're watching this asynchronously from somewhere else at some point in the future, feel free to provide feedback, and hopefully we can get to some more of it. But yeah.
And if you want to put any kind of useful resources or links or anything in the comments, please do.
That would be super helpful, and we will be monitoring those. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks to Brian.
Thanks you, Brian.
Yeah. See you guys next time.
Thanks, Mila.
Thank